Hi, everyone, and welcome to this next episode of the Sustainable Connections podcast. I'm Mark Lee. I'm the Global Director of Thought Leadership at ERM and really delighted to get to host this series of conversations. And the topic we're going to be tackling is hydrogen and how ecosystem approaches to hydrogen development are incredibly important, what are sometimes referred to as hydrogen valleys. Ben, I want to turn to you first just to maybe explain for folks who don't know the organization what HYCAP is and tell us what your role is there, and also how did hydrogen come to be your focus of professional interest?
I'm the Chief Technology Officer at HYCAP. HYCAP is an investment fund, effectively a private equity fund, looking to invest in, hydrogen and its derivatives in order to try to get this difficult bit of the energy transition going. I guess my role here is primarily about, strategy for the company in terms of trying to build an overall investment case for getting hydrogen investments to work, and then also screening investment opportunities as they come in. How did I get into hydrogen? I've probably got some of the greyest hair in the hydrogen sector. I started my career on hydrogen back in the early 2000s and worked as a consultant trying to get hydrogen from the early days when it was really a technological problem, early scale hydrogen deployments, can it work? All the way through to today, where we're in this kind of pseudo commercial world, trying to get first projects built at a proper scale and starting to work from a commercial perspective. So I've wedded myself to hydrogen since the start of my career on the basis of its importance in completing the energy transition.
All interesting. And Patrick, please tell us about MorGen. Tell us why it's got a new name. Tell us what the organization's trying to do, and why are you working on hydrogen?
Well, let's start with me, why I work on hydrogen. And the reason for this is very simple. So climate change has always been a concern, and climate change goes hand in hand with the energy transition. And a few years back, I actually did, together with my brother, we made an assessment on how the energy transition could look like, and nothing seemed to have made sense. And we just couldn't put the parts together. And when we threw in hydrogen into the equation, we actually realized that that would be a missing link. So I still believe and I'm confident that the energy transition will not be possible without hydrogen. But I'm also aware that it's not only hydrogen that's needed for the energy transition. We have then started the company in 2014. I've joined operationally in 2017, so a bit more than 7 years now. And my focus had always been, because I do have a financial background, I've worked with an investment bank for more than 23 years. And my focus has always been on the financial viability, commercial assessment, and financing aspects of all the hydrogen projects. The company then entered into a joint venture with Trafigura, and Trafigura has in the meantime got the majority of this joint venture. So we thought in order to avoid any confusion, we had to go for a name change to get the two companies easily being separated. And MorGen was the decision that we took for the joint venture. And it basically originates from more generation in whatever form you want to take this. But I think MorGen Energy is a very beautiful name for us to work for.
Yeah, I hope it works not only as a brand, but in delivering its exact promise there of more generation and more energy for all of us. I love that we went from private equity to what had just shades of a family business, with you and your brother doing your analysis in the background. And you described getting to a point where there was a hole in your analysis and hydrogen managed to fit in as the missing puzzle piece. Why did it, for you, complete the picture in a way that you've kind of ended up making it your career?
It's actually a very personal story that I could tell because it basically was one night at 2 a.m. and I was working on a financial plan for the Swiss ecosystem. And when I tried to arrange the hydrogen transport and storage, I got remembered to how the body works with the mitochondria that are being fed by ADP, adenosine triphosphate. And I realized that it's actually basically hydrogen that the body works on. And that was for me a personal, an emotional point that I reached. And I said, okay, this is what I really want to do. going forward. But on a more technical side, we need more renewables if we want to execute on the energy transition. But renewables have just sort of the characteristics that they never appear in space or time where they need it. So you need to have the ability to transport them and to store them. And so you need to have large capacity of storage. And hydrogen is simply the only technology at this point in time that could actually fill that gap.
That possibility to be a unique actor in the energy transition. I like both the personal and the professional sides of that answer coming together, Patrick. Thanks for humoring me on it. Joe, can you please tell me about your role inside ERM and the way in which you're connected to the hydrogen work as well?
Yes, of course. So my name's Joe Howes. I'm a partner in ERM in our Sustainable Energy Solutions team. So that's a team of people that works on everything beyond conventional renewables. So how the energy system works and might change when you introduce new technologies like hydrogen, but also other things like other low carbon fuels, CCUS, changes to electricity and gas networks, low carbon buildings, all kinds of things like that. So I came to this originally, it's 22 years ago now. I wrote my master's thesis on the potential for renewable hydrogen as a transport fuel in the UK. I actually started out as studying material science and realized that the bits of material science I was interested in, quite a lot of them were related to fuel cells and hydrogen. And that led me to the energy masters, which led me to that hydrogen thesis. I went straight from working on that thesis to being a consultant in the area and have been pretty much answering those same kinds of questions ever since. So nowadays, my work is, in general, I focus on how policy supports lots of areas of the energy transition, specifically in hydrogen, low carbon fuels, CCUS, and things like direct air capture, because the policy in all of those areas interacts with each other. So I think about how policy creates markets and can create value.
And Joe, can you give us a hint, given the policy comments there at the end, of what the agenda will be in Brussels next week at Hydrogen Week? Is that where the European policy framework gets shaped annually and refreshed? Do you look to it for those signals?
I mean, I think it's one of the places where those discussions will be had, but people in this sector are talking about policy all the time. Like in many areas of sustainable energy, policy is really crucial to creating the market, but also to setting the conditions for how development happens. So things like sustainability criteria. And so there are all, at every event, there's discussion that's about policy, because that's a thread running through everything.
Great. We'll probably return to the policy front before this conversation is over too, but one more person. And Lisa, I really want to get to you. And please tell us, I know you're also part of Sustainable Energy Solutions, but your role and again, how you've patched into hydrogen as a focus.
All right. Well, I've been involved in the hydrogen sector in different capacities since 2012, as I joined my first role, originally in Element Energy as a consultant. And I'm now currently an associate partner in ERM. I'm based in France and I'm part of Joe's team in SES as well. I lead a team that is working on supporting the delivery of innovative energy projects in Europe. And we have a specialism in hydrogen, in coordinated funded project, but also in supporting making projects happen. And so I've been involved in hydrogen because that's typically a sector where you need a lot of support for public and private partners to work together to make projects happen.
Terrific, Lisa. And thanks all of you for spending time on the intros and kind of setting the frame a little bit for the conversation with your expertise. So one of the things I'm struck by is how many decades of expertise and work you've had together on hydrogen. And I'll be curious as we work through to hear how you think it's different today or similar to what you've experienced over the years. If we almost put this hydrogen conversation again in the context of sustainable connections, we're talking about changing the whole system. How do we make the transition to a low carbon and ultimately net zero future? And how do we do that more quickly than we've been moving so far? So hydrogen strikes me, definitely the least informed person on this call, as a system solution or one of the enabling system solutions. But in itself, it's an incredibly complicated piece to develop. And so The total energy system is proving a bit slow overall to change. We're seeing it accelerate in different ways now. How do we make hydrogen accelerate itself is one of the things I'm curious about. And I want to dig into these hydrogen ecosystems, the hydrogen valleys, and how we develop them, scale them, and move them forward. Ben, I want to come back to you. And from that investor perspective in the space, can you describe a bit more fully the ecosystem approach and how that shapes some of your investing?
I think it's important to understand from an investor perspective that any investment you make in the hydrogen space automatically fits into an ecosystem, come what may. There's a dimension from renewable energy through hydrogen production, through packaging to end use, which is a sort of long chain. And then there's also another dimension of all of the technology which has to be produced, manufactured, and then supplied into the system. And the important thing to understand about hydrogen is that pretty much every single actor in that chain is doing something as we move to commercialization on a scale that they haven't done before, and also often using new technologies and challenging existing regulations, making the whole thing very complex and very hard for each of the individual actors. And what we're then seeing is when you consider the investment in any individual piece of the system, it becomes very complex. You look left or right in the chain and you see all of those risks which your counterparty is bearing in the system, and you get very spooked as an investor, and you start to demand quite significant contractual ways of recognizing and mitigating you against those risks. And that's proving really hard in practice. And I'd say that's one of the things which is slowing down the speed at which hydrogen projects are getting to FID, just the degree of risk management which people are expecting within the ecosystem. So at HYCAP, what we're trying to do is take a slightly different approach, what we call an ecosystem approach to investing. It's probably a slightly different use of the word than Patrick might use. But essentially, we're looking to invest in companies from the production through the distribution and packaging all the way through to the end use, who are basically deploying companies, and also companies who are doing the manufacturing of the manufactured goods into those systems. And the idea is that by investing like that, we can put our arms around the whole thing and take the big, bold step to scale and more plausible economics together as a single coordinated approach. And we actually build that into our investment approach. For every individual investment that we make, we do an appraisal of the company as an individual company. It's effectively as a standalone entity. Does it work as a standalone entity? Does it make sense as an investment? But we also check, does it work with all of our portfolio companies? What's the synergies that we can expect from our portfolio companies? Also our investors, and also the various partners that we've attracted along the way. And we won't make an investment into a company until we see both of those things getting a big firm tick. And that's the way we look to try to cement the ecosystem approach into our way of doing things. And I guess we're seeing three main benefits from that approach. The first is confidence. So because we can see and control all aspects of the chain, it gives us confidence to make investments significantly earlier than some of the other actors in the chain who are requiring this heavily contractualized approach. The second is around diversification. Because we've got multiple end users in our ecosystem and also multiple sources, just like a biological ecosystem, we feel that gives greater stability. And actually what we're finding when we take our projects to larger scale investors, big equity and bank investors, is they're valuing that multi-offtaker or multi-sourcing strategy far more than the single sourcing approaches, which we've seen in some of the projects, which again have been struggling to FID. And then the final point is just around price. Because we can see the economics of each of the individual steps in the ecosystem, we can persuade our portfolio companies to work together to give an all-in offer to the customer, which starts to give a plausible ownership proposition, either in an as-a-service model or just simply making sure that all of the components of the system work economically for the end customer. And because we can see the economics, it gives us the confidence to make the investments up the chain, and the thing becomes a bit of a virtuous circle. And that's really how we think about the ecosystem approach to investing.
Terrific. I like the breakdown and the three elements that let you overcome some of the fears that come with looking across the complexity of the system. Can you give us one example of an investment that the firm's made, maybe where the synergies were particularly high, or one of the other aspects that let you move forward?
Yeah, sure. I think the UK is a particularly good example. In the UK, we have one of our portfolio companies called HYGEN has secured the largest subsidized hydrogen project. It's a 35 megawatt project in Bradford. And that gives us very low cost hydrogen, thanks to the generous subsidies which are available in the UK. They will then partner with another one of our portfolio companies who's called RISE, who is basically distributing hydrogen and learning the process of distributing hydrogen today through to customers in the industrial sector and also early transport customers. And then we've also got JCB as one of our effectively investors. And we have an investment in a company called Wrightbus, who makes hydrogen buses. Basically two very big end users, both of whom are commercializing hydrogen vehicles as we speak. And the confidence that we get from understanding the economics of those vehicle manufacturers, as well as the industrial customers that RISE, the distribution company, has, gives us the confidence to take the final investment decision in the Bradford project and thereby get this whole ecosystem going. And what we're then doing is we're managing to get a complete hydrogen system up and running in an area which everyone sees as having lots of potential, the construction sector, the large heavy goods sector, but where there has been a real struggle to get one side or the other of the equation to work, either on the supply or on the vehicle side.
Great. Really helps bring it to life for me, and I'm sure for folks listening out there. Patrick, I want to shift over to you. And you mentioned your own banking and investment background, but we kind of have you here today as the project developer. So you're helping to build these things that Ben is trying to assess and make decisions about in terms of investment. And would love to have you from that project development perspective also talk about ecosystems and how you approach them to identify potential projects. What makes them look attractive to you from the developer side?
Yeah, it's an extremely important question because obviously there's a lot of opportunities out there. There's investment opportunities, project opportunities, and you need to have a consistent way to objectively measure their attractiveness. And what we do is we measure them in three clusters, which is basically infrastructure, regulation, and market demand on this. On the infrastructure side, we're concerned on where do we get cheap power at large numbers of hours per year to produce hydrogen, to keep the cost low. But also, where do we have access for transportation of hydrogen, i.e. Pipelines, or where will pipelines be developed? So that's an extremely important point. The second one is the regulatory environment. And I believe, Joe, I'm really curious on what you have to say on this. I don't see any renewable project sort of getting the feet off the ground if the regulation don't change, because markets are somehow efficient to some extent and mostly. And if regulations don't change, markets don't change. And we need markets actually to be efficient, transparent, and have cheap hydrogen available. So the regulatory environment is critical. How stable is the regulatory framework? Are there any carbon-free incentives? Is there a general appetite or need from governments or authorities for green hydrogen projects? And thirdly, obviously, it's the market demand, where we assess whether we're going to be able to find bankable offtake contracts and where the willingness to pay is from these different offtakers. And if there's a project which is already existing or in the build-up or after the final investment decision had been taken, we also need to look at the technology. And there we unromantically strongly favor proven technology. We want to build large-scale ecosystems. And if you want to do large-scale ecosystems, it doesn't work unless you have a proven technology, because if a new technology doesn't provide the solution which initially promises, it makes the ecosystem break there. So those are the points that we're looking at when we assess it. Yeah.
Joe, this is essentially your day-to-day, I think. You're looking across policies that support decarbonization, of course, focused on hydrogen and clean fuels. What does the current environment look like, and kind of what is the pace of change? Give us a deeper sense what's happening in the policy regime right now and what might be next.
There's been a huge amount of development and a huge amount of debate on these policies, but they're not fully developed yet. So one really important one is in Europe, we have the Renewable Energy Directive. So that sets a target that each European member state needs to meet for renewable energy use. And within that, there are specific targets for using renewable hydrogen and fuels made from that hydrogen in the transport sector, and also in industry. But the important thing about that is it's a directive. It's up to each member state to work out how they're going to implement it in practice. And they're all at different stages of actually doing that and all thinking about doing it in different ways. In transport, there was a bit of a boost because some policies were in place for biofuels that have been adapted for hydrogen, which could, already get some revenue into hydrogen use in transport. But for use of hydrogen in industry, that debate's at a much earlier stage, with very little clarity about how each member state will actually make that happen. So I expect that to be one of the really big topics of debate in this month. So I think those policies are really good at thinking about how we set an overall market framework and how demand should be created in the long term, but they're not fully defined today. They don't create a bankable market, even for an individual one of those value chains in many cases, never mind a more branched ecosystem. They also don't cover the whole of the value chain. I talked about transport and industry. There's also support for hydrogen production through things like the Hydrogen Bank, which is an auction for a fixed subsidy for 10 years. But that doesn't mean there's a full policy framework for everything that anybody might want to do with hydrogen. Not every production pathway, not all of the potential end users you might have in power or industrial heat or steel making or chemicals or anything else that you might want to do in that more branched ecosystem to get it all to work. So typically more specific support has been really key. And until you know what support there's going to be, it's very difficult to plan one of those more branched ecosystems to work out how you do that most efficiently, either in terms of, I'd say in terms of money or in terms of efficiency and greenhouse gas emissions.
To the language of ecosystems, value chains, and the notion of the branches of a more complicated value chain, I think is really interesting instead of a simple linear picture. Lisa, I want to bring some of this over to you, and you also do on the ground project work, often trying to join up the various actors in the ecosystem or the value chain. Suppliers, users, regulators, funders, everybody. Can you talk a little bit about how the ecosystems and the relationships within it are evolving, especially within the context of a still fractured policy environment and otherwise?
The first project we were involved with originally were first of a kind project, typically looking with low technology readiness level, low TRL level. And the focus for this project were really much to look at specific sites, innovative sort of trial, looking at very specific set of activities, maybe one hydrogen stations, hydrogen refueling station, and maybe a small fleet of hydrogen buses, for example. And this was the original project. And then a second wave of a project that happened since. This typically look at higher TRL levels, larger scale deployment, and the opportunity for this project and the objective really for this project was to look at diversifying the type of technologies that were being tested, facilitating the entry of new entrants into the market, and also preparing for a more commercial rollout at this stage. And I guess now we are in a consolidation phase, and really the objective is to have projects that work as ecosystem, as described by the other speaker today. And really what I guess the objective is, and that's objectives that are shared by both the regulator or private operator, is to make projects that have more impact, projects that are feasible, and also projects that are scalable. And that's the focus today. And really where we see that collaborative, innovative project happening today is in that space, in those building those ecosystems. And that's where you see funding available from Europe, for example, through the ecosystem support that they have in place. And that's something that they describe as a hydrogen valley themselves. But maybe we can come back to that in a minute.
Yeah, no, I hope to come back to several things. Thanks, Lisa. And I want to cross over some of the things you said and give them back to other speakers. And Ben, I was curious to come back to you on the policy front, in that policy certainty helps set an investment framework. Policy that is overly prescriptive can also kind of pick the winners that you're probably trying to pick as an investor. So what are you looking for from an investor perspective in the policy space at present?
It's very important that any investment we make, the policies which are made available will last for the duration of the investment. So if there's any risk of the policies being removed or tweaked or changed after we've made the investment, then that's a killer for our ability to make the investment. I think the second point, it probably speaks to what Joe was saying, which is that the policies are often either applied on the supply side or on the demand side, but rarely in both. We see that really starkly in the difference between the UK and Europe. In the UK, we have effectively a supply-based push, so we can get hydrogen subsidized down to the cost of natural gas, but there's relatively little imperative for people to take it up. And in Europe, it's the other way around. A lot of markets have been mandated to take up the hydrogen, but actually the hydrogen that's being produced is being produced at a relatively high cost. And that's then scaring people because they worry about what happens when those mandates get removed. So I would say a balanced approach between demand and supply policies, and the most important thing being certainty. I guess a final point would be realism. Some of these policies have been set in a way that they're probably expecting price levels which can't be hit in the early years of the deployment of hydrogen. There's lots to learn. And I think the more successful policies, we look across the piece, again, Joe would have more to say, but if we look across the piece for the successful policies which have subsidized the aspects of the energy transition, they've generally been willing to be generous initially, rather than really penny pinching initially, because you need to leave some give, for margin for investors, but more for covering that risk premium for the investors when projects inevitably slightly overrun. So if we look at the money that was available in solar, for example, they were very generous incentives and helped drive a rapid decrease in price for solar. We haven't really seen that generosity in hydrogen because of the fear of effectively over subsidizing. And I would probably encourage regulators to be just a little bit looser, particularly in the early years.
Got it. Thank you. And Patrick, how is the current regulatory framework guiding your project site selection? Like where is it looking most appealing at present?
Well, at present we got 2 projects, and actually I'm very much aligned with what Ben said. That have progressed far, and one of them is in Wales, Milford Haven, Wales, where we produce hydrogen, and we're being part of support for production and fully support what Ben said, that the support for production in the UK is extremely generous these days at the moment. The other side is in Denmark, and in Denmark, or on the continent, you benefit less from that kind of support. So you really have to look after the cost side. And in my view, we have started that project in Esbjerg, Denmark, on the 1 gigawatt P2X production plant about 4 years ago. And I can honestly state that there has not been a day where I didn't think it wasn't the best location in Europe to start this, because it provides access to renewables. The government wants to is tendering wind farms at this moment, which produce power to an extent that it can't be absorbed from the electric grid. So they need P2X to actually get a good price on that tender for the wind farms. And it's also very in close proximity to Germany, which is going to be one of the world's largest hydrogen off-taker in the coming years with the pipeline. There's some questions on the pipeline from Denmark to Germany, but there has been a very strong statement from Germany on their 9,000 kilometer pipeline that they plan to be operating by 33, and smaller parts much earlier. So I think Denmark definitely has the best position to be a leading hydrogen producer. Nevertheless, it's not all perfect. It isn't anywhere, and I think the government would need to step up there to make the right decisions in terms of permitting process to actually execute on these projects. I think that's we're lagging a bit of proactive approach from the government, who are willing to do the changes, but so far have not gone all the way with these changes.
Perfect. And Patrick, in there, you said Joe would probably have more to say about this. And Joe, I want to test and kind of carrying forward this theme, especially folks listening outside of Europe don't understand a directive has to be interpreted by each country. So there's room for kind of flexibility within the framework. And so whether it's because of differences of interpretation in Europe, Joe, or even whether it's outside of Europe, are you seeing areas of policy innovation that you hope kind of catch on and scale in other places?
I mean, this is being used in hydrogen, but also has been pretty successful in other sectors in Europe, is the idea of contracts for difference. So the idea of negotiated contracts between government and project developers, where there is a discussion around the costs and the revenues of the project, and then depending on the revenue and how that varies, the government subsidizing the difference. So this is a very different approach from, for example, the tax credit approach taken in the US, where you've got a fixed subsidy. Now, some in industry love fixed subsidies because it's got some certainty, at least around the level of the subsidy, not necessarily about whether it'll be there in the future.
Yeah.
Which, given the election results in the US, we don't know. But some in industry like that because it's very simple. You do your project economics, you put in the fixed tax credit, you decide whether it makes sense or not. The difference with this contracts for difference approach that's been quite widely used in different sectors and in different countries in the EU is that negotiation allows for more complexity. So if you have a project that's producing different products or benefiting from potentially more than one different type of subsidy, you can adjust the amount that the government needs to pay to try to avoid the over subsidy that Ben was talking about governments being scared of. And it's seen that it's worked quite well in some renewable electricity sectors, and I think it's that the use of that model in hydrogen is also, it remains to be seen exactly how it plays out, but is something new. So I think that's an interesting policy approach to consider using in other parts of the world.
Thanks, Joe. And I'm going to bend a different question to you, Lisa, and then I'm conscious of time too. And I do want to do one kind of final lightning round with all of you. But Lisa, the place I wanted to go that we have not touched is kind of the community and society side of this. And, all of the energy transition is happening or is supposed to be happening in the context of just transition. When we start talking about 9,000 kilometer pipelines, we know that there are going to be a whole host of different feelings about the pipeline and where it is and why it is. Can you just talk about how community and societal engagement is working in the context of hydrogen and what maybe needs to evolve?
I think historically there's been some work done to try to explain, I suppose, what these benefits are for these communities. And at this stage, and it's another challenge that project developers have to face, they have to be the communication specialist in this topic. And you increasingly have a number of institutions and associations and agencies that can support. But those project developers have really to sort of try and test the methods and approach to communicate with local communities, but not only those, to also persuade local authorities, local politicians of the value and the benefit of their project. And that can make or break a project potentially. And I think we are going to see more of this in the future. The more you see projects getting to scale, the more this will be an issue that will need to be addressed comprehensively. To some extent, a number of the projects we work have been first of a kind prototype project to date. And that does come with the benefits of not necessarily requiring quite as much engagement as sort of a classic energy project with local communities. But again, in the future, this is likely to change.
Thanks, Lisa. And I'm glad we could bring at least a flavor of that in. I think that all of this, not just hydrogen, but energy transition broadly depends so much on societal acceptance at every stage. And it's a conversation that we obviously need to accelerate as well, that the new infrastructure and other aspects of this simply aren't being rolled out fast enough to keep up with the ambitions and the goals we've set for transition. I want to come back to all of you with kind of one final question and just do a bit of a lightning round. We've been talking in the context of ecosystems, the regulatory funding, project development, community aspects of them. And my final question for you is just as you look ahead, we're mid-decade. So for 2025, what is a shift in the nature of the ecosystem that you hope to see that will enable faster scaling?
I think the thing for me that's really important is getting clarity on how hydrogen might be used in industry in Europe and what policy will drive that. Because, from when we started working on this, many of us, quite a few years ago, we were looking for the best use cases. Now we're also seeing this from the other side. We're seeing lots of industries with pressures to decarbonize, and they're looking at everything that's in the toolbox to decarbonize. And many of them are coming to hydrogen as potentially an area that could really help them. But they need to know, whether they need to do it, when they need to do it, how they're going to do it, who's going to pay for it. And that's a really key question for me.
Yeah, makes absolute sense from my perspective that we need to see stronger, clearer signals there. Ben, how about for you?
At a sector level, we need to see more of the projects, particularly the projects which are independently developed, reaching final investment decisions. So at the moment, we do see a ramp up in the number of projects which are getting given the green light, but most of them are being developed in very tightly controlled ecosystems, to use the topic, in refineries where, for example, the refiner also owns a wind farm and is then prepared to build an electrolyzer. So very much sort of within closed ecosystems. What I would like to see is the companies that are developing slightly more open ecosystem facing projects getting to final investment decision. So those are generally projects that are being developed perhaps more by independent developers or by smaller companies. So it's a harder investment proposition, and often targeting some of the end uses which are slightly less mature or kind of easy. The refinery is relatively easy because it already uses hydrogen. So at a macro level, that's what I'd like to see happen. That would give us as investors in those types of companies a lot more confidence, and I think it would give our investors more confidence. How does that happen? I mean, we've talked about the importance of regulation, regulatory stability. So I would say that's probably the key request. I personally would like to see more attention given to getting hydrogen in some of the higher value segments going, in particular heavy duty mobility, maritime, some of the derivatives in maritime, and also the construction sector, which looks quite promising as an early use case.
Yeah, love to see more of those use cases accelerating for sure. Lisa, and then Patrick, we're going to give you the last word. Lisa, what's kind of your look ahead wish?
Yeah, I guess to follow on from sort of the statement just made by Ben here on this project need to be successful, take final investment decision. I think there are a lot of very positive elements today to make this happen, and probably a couple of the additional elements that are missing that would really help the project progress to that stage is having frameworks that allow them to build confidence and trust across their partnership. So finding approaches that mean that they are able to work together and progress step by step into taking those critical investment decisions to a stage where they are confident that they are sharing the risk fairly. And that would require some sort of confidence from coming from government and from the regulation, but there are also some of these that can be done through slightly creative, I suppose, private partner working together. And then the other area that I guess we kind of need to work on collectively is looking at developing the skills for project developer, project manager, and looking at recognizing that there's a need for a tailored approach for each of these projects. And I think sometimes the framework that exists are a bit intransigent. You have to follow sort of a recognized approach, but each project is going to be very different. And even if there are similar projects that have happened in the past, this project, we need something a little bit different. So it's helpful to bring this flexibility, allow to recognize the complexity of this sector to make it possible for this earlier investor to be able to go all the way to making those ambitious projects happen.
Yeah, I'm sensing from the multi-barreled answers that all of you have a long list of wishes for further change to accelerate this. Patrick, you get the last shot at this to build on the rich set of ideas we've just heard.
Yeah, I probably also have the largest list that I could wish for. So first of all, it's very straightforward. If you want more project to reach the final investment decision, you need two things. And one of them is you need more renewable and you need pipeline. I think that would be a huge catalyst. And that's the most important thing to understand. But now the third point that I want to raise on, and we touched on it, on having capital expenditure support, having operational expenditure support. The third point is I don't believe in this supporting system to a large extent. If we want to decarbonize, various studies show that you need 100 to 150 trillions by 2050. This is an amount which by far exceeds the capacity of every government. So what you need is you need the market. And if you want to engage the market, then you need a CO2 pricing. And I think the CO2 pricing is by far the most effective tool, because it doesn't make the government to make decisions on which technology needs to be used in which area. And the market can do this very effectively itself. But you need to find a way to charge industries that emit CO2, so they have an incentive to mitigate their CO2 emissions. So that's on my Christmas list. Definitely on top is the CO2 price.
Well, I hope you all will get what you have wished for, if not in 2025, then very soon after, so that we can see this advance. For everybody who's been listening to us today, I just want to remind, I've been speaking with Ben Madden, the CTO of HYCAP, and Patrick Huber of MorGen Energy. Really appreciate both of you coming to join this conversation with me and my ERM colleagues, Joe Howes and Lisa Ruff. For folks who are interested in the Sustainable Connections podcast series, you can find all of the past episodes on the ERM website at erm.com. If you have any feedback on this episode or any of the other ones, we would love to hear from you. For now, final words, just thanks to all of my panelists and best wishes to all of you for a good remainder of your day and good rest of this week. Thanks so much, and bye for now.